The police lights reflected off the windows of my house like a warning meant for everyone watching. Neighbors froze mid-step. Curtains shifted. Phones appeared. The HOA president stood a little too confidently at the curb, arms crossed, lips tight, already certain she had won. They hadn't come to ask questions. They'd come to intimidate me. And the HOA believed that fear would do what fines and threats had failed to accomplish. It started with a $300 violation notice, taped crookedly to my door. No clear explanation. No proper reference. Just a demand and a deadline. I didn't ignore it. I responded. I asked for documentation. I requested a hearing. Every step I took followed their rules more closely than they ever had. That's what annoyed them most. When I refused to panic, the tone changed. Emails grew sharper. Deadlines shortened. Language turned vague and threatening. They claimed authority over land I had legally owned for years. And when words didn't work, they escalated to spectacle. That's when they called the police. The officer stepped out calmly, hand resting near his belt, eyes scanning the scene. He asked who had made the call. The HOA president spoke quickly, confidently, explaining that I was refusing to comply and occupying HOA-controlled property. She said it like it was obvious. Like the paperwork didn't matter. The officer turned to me and asked a simple question. Do you have proof of ownership? I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I handed him a thick folder I'd been carrying for months. Inside were deeds, amendments, recorded clauses, and stamped documents most homeowners never bother to read. I'd read every word. Twice. As he flipped through the pages, his expression shifted. Subtle, but unmistakable. The HOA president noticed too. She interrupted, insisting the documents were irrelevant. The officer raised a hand and asked her to step back. That was the moment the balance changed. What the HOA didn't know was that years earlier, buried deep inside the original deed structure, was a clause designed to prevent exactly this kind of abuse. A clause that activated quietly when authority was overstepped. They had crossed that line repeatedly, assuming no one would ever check. The police call they made to scare me didn't end the situation. It opened it. And once the record is opened, power no longer belongs to the loudest voice on the street. It belongs to the truth on paper. The officer didn't say much at first. He stepped a few feet away, radio crackling softly as he spoke into it, eyes still scanning the documents I'd handed over. Behind him, the HOA president's confidence began to fracture. She checked her phone, then the faces of the neighbors watching, as if trying to gauge whether intimidation was still working. It wasn't. Most people think power comes from titles, boards, or loud authority. The HOA believed that too. They relied on repetition, on fear, on the assumption that no homeowner would ever challenge them with facts. That assumption had carried them for years. It was also their blind spot. When I bought the property, the title company mentioned an unusual clause in passing. Old language. Complicated wording. Nothing to worry about, they said. But I worried anyway. I requested the full chain of records, including original deeds, amendments, and every recorded transfer tied to the HOA's authority. That's where I found it. The clause wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It simply stated that if the association ever asserted control over private land without proper notice, quorum, and recorded consent, authority over common elements would automatically revert to the affected deed holder until corrected. It existed to stop abuse. Quietly. The HOA didn't violate procedure once. They did it repeatedly. Improper notices. Selective enforcement. Amendments passed without quorum. Fines issued before hearings. Each shortcut stacked invisibly against them, like weight added to a structure no one was inspecting. Back on the street, the officer returned and asked the HOA president a question she wasn't prepared for. Can you show me the recorded document granting you authority over this parcel? She referenced internal bylaws and board resolutions. The officer shook his head. Internal documents don't override county records. He turned back to my folder. The shift was subtle but final. The HOA president stopped interrupting. Her voice lowered. Her certainty evaporated. She realized this wasn't a misunderstanding she could talk her way out of. This was a record problem. The officer explained that based on the documents, this wasn't a criminal matter. It was a serious ownership dispute, and further enforcement could expose the HOA to liability. He advised them to step back and consult legal counsel. No tickets were written. No arrests made. Just a line drawn where authority had been assumed instead of proven. As the police cruiser pulled away, the neighbors didn't disperse. They whispered. They stared. For the first time, the HOA wasn't the loudest presence on the street. They had tried to use fear to end the issue. Instead, they triggered the mechanism that questioned whether they had power at all. After the police left, the street didn't return to normal. People lingered longer than usual. Conversations stayed low and cautious. The HOA president avoided eye contact as she walked back to her car, phone pressed tightly to her ear, already spinning a version of events she hoped would save her control. But control doesn't survive exposure. That evening, my inbox began filling faster than I expected. Messages from neighbors I barely knew. Some were curious. Some were nervous. A few were quietly relieved. They asked what had happened, whether the HOA had really crossed a line, whether their own fines and warnings had been legitimate. I answered carefully, sticking to facts, never exaggeration. I didn't need to persuade anyone. The documents spoke well enough on their own. The next morning, the HOA's tone shifted completely. The aggressive emails stopped. The enforcement reminders vanished. Instead, a carefully worded message appeared, claiming there would be a temporary pause on violations while a legal review was conducted. That pause was not generosity. It was fear. Associations don't pause enforcement unless they believe continuing could cause harm. And harm, in this case, meant records. Because once something is challenged at the county level, every past shortcut becomes visible. Within days, the HOA scheduled an emergency board meeting. Attendance was unusually high. Neighbors who had never spoken before asked pointed questions. Why were amendments missing from the public record? Why had notices been issued without hearings? Why were some homeowners fined while others weren't? The board answered vaguely. Their attorney avoided certainty. That uncertainty spoke volumes. Meanwhile, I submitted a formal packet to the county recorder. It included timelines, certified copies, and a clear explanation of how the deed clause had been triggered. No accusations. No emotions. Just procedure. The county responded quickly. They requested additional records from the HOA, including minutes, quorum confirmations, and enforcement logs. That request alone was devastating. Because if those documents existed cleanly, this would have ended already. They didn't. Board members began resigning quietly. Official reasons were personal. Unofficially, everyone understood why. Directors know when liability is approaching. Stepping away doesn't erase responsibility, but it changes exposure. The HOA website went offline for maintenance. Social media comments were disabled. Newsletters stopped. Silence became their strategy. But silence, once authority is questioned, isn't neutral. It's confirmation. Neighbors stopped asking if the HOA would win. They started asking what would happen if it didn't. That was when I realized something irreversible had begun. The police call wasn't the cause of their collapse. It was the spotlight. And under that light, the structure they'd built couldn't stand. The county's response arrived faster than anyone expected. Not a ruling, not a judgment, just a notice confirming that a formal review had been opened. That alone changed everything. HOA authority depends on the illusion of permanence. Reviews introduce doubt. Doubt invites scrutiny. The board attempted to regain control by framing the situation as a misunderstanding. They sent a carefully drafted email claiming cooperation and transparency. But language doesn't replace records. And records were exactly what the county demanded next. They asked for proof of quorum on key amendments. Recorded notices for enforcement actions. Evidence that authority had been properly exercised over the land in question. These weren't unusual requests. They were standard. The problem was that the HOA had treated procedure as optional for years. I watched as deadlines were extended, then quietly missed. Explanations followed. Clerical errors. Administrative oversights. Transitions between boards. Excuses stack quickly when documentation is thin. The county wasn't impressed. Meanwhile, enforcement remained frozen. No new fines. No warnings. No letters taped to doors. For some residents, it felt like relief. For others, confusion. For the board, it was suffocating. Their influence had always relied on constant pressure. Without it, their presence faded rapidly. Neighbors began comparing old notices and emails. Patterns emerged. Identical violations handled differently. Deadlines shifted without explanation. Penalties applied selectively. What once felt personal now looked systemic. The HOA's attorney requested a private meeting with me. I declined. Not out of defiance, but strategy. Private conversations disappear. Records don't. If this was going to be resolved, it needed daylight. The county issued preliminary findings. Carefully worded, but unmistakable. The deed clause had likely been triggered months earlier. Authority over common elements appeared compromised. Further enforcement without correction could increase liability. That language spread quickly. Confidence collapsed. More board members resigned. The remaining ones stopped communicating entirely. Meetings were cancelled. Agendas disappeared. The association that once micromanaged everything now struggled to exist at all. One afternoon, I walked past the HOA sign at the community entrance. The paint was chipped. The logo outdated. For years, it had symbolized control. Now it looked like a relic. They had assumed intimidation would protect them. They believed no one would challenge their authority with patience and paperwork. They were wrong. Power hadn't been taken from them in a dramatic moment. It had slipped away quietly, line by line, record by record, until there was nothing left to defend. And the review wasn't finished yet. The HOA's silence grew heavier with each passing day. What once felt like control through constant messaging had turned into complete withdrawal. No updates. No explanations. No attempt to reassure residents. Silence wasn't accidental. It was strategic. And it was also revealing. Homeowners noticed immediately. Questions flooded community group chats. People shared screenshots of old violation notices, unexplained fines, and emails that suddenly felt questionable. When authority disappears without explanation, curiosity replaces fear. And curiosity spreads faster than intimidation ever did. The county requested final documentation. This time, there were no extensions. The deadline was firm. Either the HOA could prove uninterrupted authority, or the record would reflect otherwise. That pressure exposed fractures that could no longer be hidden. One remaining board member resigned publicly, citing ethical concerns. The wording was careful, but the message was clear. Distance was becoming a form of self-preservation. Directors understand liability. They also understand when a structure is collapsing. The HOA's attorney sent a short notice stating they would temporarily suspend operations pending the county's determination. That sentence changed everything. An association that suspends itself admits uncertainty. And uncertainty is incompatible with authority. Meanwhile, neighbors began treating me differently. Not with praise, not with expectation, but with trust. They asked procedural questions. What happens next? Who maintains shared spaces? How are expenses handled? I answered honestly. Nothing changes until the record changes. Stability matters more than speed. Behind the scenes, the county completed its review. They didn't editorialize. They didn't assign blame. They simply compared what should have happened with what did. Missing filings. Improper enforcement. Unauthorized assertions of control. Each discrepancy weakened the HOA's claim further. The police call that started everything appeared in the timeline as a minor entry. Not decisive, but symbolic. The moment intimidation crossed into official scrutiny. Once a record exists, it invites comparison. And comparison is unforgiving. I received a call from the county clerk confirming the review was concluding. Their tone was neutral, professional. They explained that due to the triggered deed clause and unresolved procedural failures, authority over common elements would be updated in the public record. No drama. No confrontation. Just an administrative correction. That night, I walked through the neighborhood and noticed something subtle. People were outside. Talking. Relaxed. The atmosphere had changed. Not because someone had taken control, but because fear had quietly left. The HOA hadn't lost power in a courtroom or a shouting match. It had lost it through inaction, silence, and the assumption that no one would ever check. But someone did. And the record was about to reflect it. The confirmation arrived without warning. No dramatic announcement. No meeting. Just a certified notice from the county recorder stating that the ownership authority file had been updated. The language was technical, restrained, and final. Due to unresolved procedural violations and activation of the original deed clause, administrative and enforcement authority over the common elements no longer rested with the HOA. It wasn't a transfer. It was an acknowledgement. The authority had already shifted. The record was simply catching up. The remaining board members received the same notice. Within hours, emails followed. Some were confused, others defensive, a few quietly resigned. One message asked what authority even meant now. That question revealed how fragile their control had always been. They had enforced rules without fully understanding the structure that allowed them to exist. The HOA website went offline completely. The enforcement email bounced back automated replies. The phone number rang unanswered. Systems built on assumed power collapse quickly once that assumption disappears. Neighbors gathered in small groups, trying to understand what the update meant for daily life. Would services stop? Would shared spaces be neglected? Would chaos follow? It didn't. Nothing changed overnight. The roads remained clean. The lights stayed on. The lake was still maintained. Fear had exaggerated the HOA's importance far beyond its actual function. I contacted the county for guidance. They advised transparency and restraint. Any actions affecting common areas should be documented, minimal, and reversible. This wasn't about control. It was about stability until a long-term solution was chosen. A few residents knocked on my door, cautious but hopeful. They asked how decisions would be made. I explained simply. No fines. No selective enforcement. Only necessary maintenance and open communication. That clarity spread faster than panic ever could. The former HOA president sent one final message. Short. Carefully worded. She disagreed with the determination but would not challenge it at this time. That sentence carried weight. Legal challenges require clean records and confidence. She had neither. The police call that once felt overwhelming now seemed small. It hadn't caused this outcome. It had accelerated it. The moment the HOA invited scrutiny, they lost control of the process. Holding the notice in my hands, I understood something most people never experience. Power doesn't always move loudly. Sometimes it shifts quietly, through paperwork, patience, and the simple act of reading what others ignore. The HOA hadn't been defeated. It had been corrected. And correction, once recorded, doesn't ask for permission. With the record updated, the hardest part wasn't authority. It was restraint. After years of watching rules enforced through fear and pressure, it would have been easy to mirror that behavior. But intimidation had already proven itself unnecessary. The moment fear disappeared, cooperation quietly replaced it. The first step was communication. A clear, written notice went out to every homeowner explaining the situation in plain language. No legal threats. No complex jargon. Just facts, timelines, and reassurance that daily life would remain stable. Transparency wasn't a gesture. It was a safeguard. The response was immediate and unexpected. Instead of resistance, people expressed relief. Some admitted they'd avoided speaking up for years. Others shared stories of fines that never made sense or warnings that arrived without explanation. What once felt personal now looked procedural. That shift mattered. Requests followed quickly. Could regular maintenance continue? How would shared costs be handled? Who would coordinate services? Authority creates questions. Ignoring them would have created uncertainty. I worked closely with the county to ensure every action was documented, minimal, and reversible. Nothing happened off the record. Former board members remained quiet. A few reached out privately, offering help with the transition. I declined politely. Any involvement could blur accountability. Clear boundaries were necessary to rebuild trust. Something else became obvious. Without constant enforcement emails and threats, compliance didn't collapse. Lawns stayed trimmed. Shared spaces were respected. People behaved responsibly when treated fairly. The assumption that control required intimidation proved false. The county scheduled a public session to discuss long-term options. Rebuilding the HOA with corrected bylaws. Appointing an independent administrator. Or dissolving the association entirely. Each option carried consequences. But for the first time, residents would decide with full information. Preparation mattered. Every document was organized. Every decision logged. If the process was going to survive scrutiny, it had to be cleaner than what it replaced. Authority without accountability simply recreates the problem under a different name. Neighbors began talking differently. Not about violations or fines, but about responsibility. Volunteering. Oversight. Shared effort. Community doesn't need control to exist. It needs clarity and fairness. The police call felt distant now, almost irrelevant. Yet it remained the turning point. Not because it scared anyone, but because it forced attention. The HOA had wanted submission. Instead, they received examination. Power hadn't moved into my hands alone. It had moved into the open. And once authority becomes visible, it can no longer hide behind fear. The public session was held on a quiet weekday evening, but attendance rivaled any major event the community had seen. Chairs filled quickly. Some residents stood along the walls. Others listened from the hallway. This wasn't curiosity. It was investment. People finally believed their voices mattered. The county representative opened with a summary of findings. Calm. Neutral. Methodical. Procedural violations. Triggered deed clause. Temporary shift of authority. Options for resolution. No emotion, no blame. Just facts placed on the table where no one could ignore them. 3 paths were outlined clearly. The HOA could be rebuilt with corrected bylaws, strict oversight, and mandatory compliance audits. An independent administrator could be appointed for a defined period. Or the association could be dissolved entirely, with responsibilities redistributed through recorded agreements and shared easements. None of the options were easy. All were transparent. Discussion followed slowly at first, then more openly. Residents shared experiences without anger. Selective enforcement. Unclear fees. Fear of retaliation. Patterns emerged that no single complaint could have revealed. This wasn't about one bad board. It was about a structure that allowed unchecked authority to grow. The former HOA president attended but didn't speak. She sat near the back, expression controlled, listening as her role dissolved into irrelevance. Authority had moved beyond personalities. That was the point. When it was my turn, I kept it brief. I reminded everyone that the situation didn't start with a desire for control. It started with intimidation. And intimidation failed the moment records mattered more than voices. Whatever choice was made needed to prevent that from happening again. The vote was scheduled for the following week. Ballots would be counted by the county, not internally. Transparency was non-negotiable. In the days leading up to the vote, something unexpected happened. Neighbors organized on their own. Volunteers stepped forward. People offered skills in accounting, maintenance, and oversight. When fear disappears, responsibility surfaces. Voting day arrived quietly. Turnout was higher than local elections. People waited until the final count. When the result was announced, there was no cheering. Just relief. The decision was decisive. The HOA would be dissolved. The county confirmed the outcome and outlined the transition process. Authority would return to individual property owners through recorded agreements. No single board. No unchecked power. Just clear responsibility. As people left, the mood felt lighter. Not triumphant. Free. The deed flip hadn't made me powerful. It had made power unnecessary. And that changed everything. Months later, the neighborhood looked unchanged. The houses stood where they always had. The lake reflected the sky the same way it did before any of this began. But beneath the surface, everything was different. Quietly. Permanently. There was no HOA office anymore. No violation notices taped to doors. No threatening emails with vague deadlines. Instead, there were clear agreements, shared calendars, and open communication. Problems still arose, but they were handled through discussion, not intimidation. Disagreement no longer carried consequences beyond conversation. People sometimes asked if I felt victorious. I didn't. Victory implies domination. This was never about winning control. It was about stopping something that had drifted so far from its purpose that fear had replaced fairness. Once that balance broke, correction became inevitable. The police call turned into a story neighbors told newcomers. Not dramatically. Almost casually. They really thought that would scare her, someone would say. And that was the truth. Intimidation only works when no one checks the foundation underneath it. What stayed with me most wasn't the legal process or the deed clause. It was how fragile authority becomes once it's examined. The HOA had relied on routine. On silence. On the belief that homeowners would comply instead of question. That belief collapsed the moment documentation mattered more than confidence. I kept the folder of papers. Not because I needed it anymore, but as a reminder. Systems don't fail loudly at first. They erode slowly, through shortcuts and assumptions, until someone pauses long enough to notice. Occasionally, I'd see former board members at the store or walking near the lake. We nodded politely. No apologies were exchanged. None were necessary. Accountability doesn't require confrontation once the record speaks clearly. If there was a lesson in all of this, it wasn't about power. It was about patience. About reading what others assume you won't. About understanding that ownership isn't claimed. It's recorded. And intimidation loses its grip the moment it meets someone willing to document instead of react. They called the police to scare me into submission. Instead, they created a timestamp. A moment the system couldn't ignore. Everything that followed happened not out of anger, but out of procedure. The HOA didn't end because I fought it. It ended because it forgot why it existed. Communities don't need rulers. They need rules that apply evenly, or they eventually collapse under their own weight. Sometimes, the quietest actions change everything.